نحمده ونصلي على رسول الكريم أما بعد بسم الله. Today inshallah we will do the summary of Surah Safat. So Surah Safat, the name means aligners, since the surah begins with an oath on angels who line up in the heavens like rows of people in prayers. And a brief synopsis of the surah is that this surah mentions three unseen topics: angels, jinns, and the day of resurrection. And it begins with the description of angels who line up in preparation for executing orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the surah then clarifies the misconception of disbelievers about any kinship between jinns and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The surah also informs us of the resurrection via a single cry that will gather people in the hereafter, and then describes the horrible treatment of disbelievers on the Day of Judgment. This surah elaborates the story of Ibrahim a.s. and Yunus a.s. in particular, and then also makes references to many other prophets like Nuh a.s., Ismail a.s., Musa a.s., Harun a.s., Ilyas, and Lut a.s. A virtue of this surah comes in Nisa'i. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يأمر بالتخفيف ويؤمنا بالصافات. Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam used to enjoin upon us to make the prayer short, but he would lead us in prayer and recite Surah Safat as narrated by Abdullah bin Umar. Let's go through a brief summary of various verses. So the surah begins with three oaths, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is taking oaths on His creation, but we are not allowed to take oath except by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the three oaths are أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصافات صفا فالزاجرات زجرا فالتاليات ذكرا. And scholars believe that these oaths are related to angels. So the duties of angels are mentioned here, that they stand in rows, they drive the clouds, and they recite the message or remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then in verse number 6, إِنَّا زَيَّنَّا السَّمَاءَ الدُّنْيَا بِزِينَةٍ الْكَوَاكِبِ وَحِفْظًا مِّن كُلِّ شَيْطَانٍ مَارِدٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains the different purposes of stars. So a couple of them mentioned here, one of them being the adornment of the sky with stars, and also stars being used as weapons against devils when they try to eavesdrop the communication in heavens. Then the creation of heavens and earth is mentioned, and how it is much more complex than the creation of man. فَاسْتَفْتِهِمْ أَهُمْ أَشَدُّ خَلْقًا أَمَّنْ خَلَقْنَا إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاهُمْ مِنْ طِينٍ لَازِبٍ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by referring to the creation of earth and heavens, which was obvious to the mushrikeen, that they are much bigger entities than man himself. Then if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have created sophisticated structures on earth and in sky, then why do they think it is impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to recreate human beings again in the hereafter? So that was emphasized here. Ask them, isn't the creation of the heavens and the earth more challenging, more difficult, more complex than creation of a man? And especially if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already created man once, why would that be so impossible for him to create humans again in the hereafter? And then there is a discourse mentioned in the hereafter between the leaders and their followers. The followers would try to blame the leaders. We were innocent and they misled us. So they would try to shift the blame onto their leaders. And then in counter argument, the leaders will declare acquittal from any influence that they had on their followers. قالوا إنكم كنتم تأتوننا عن اليمين. So the followers will say, look, you used to come to us claiming that what you're saying is truth, and that's why we followed you. But then the leaders will reply, قَالُوا بَل لَمْ تَكُونُوا مُؤْمِنِينَ وَمَا كَانَ لَنَا عَلَيْكُمْ مِنْ سُلْطَانٍ بَل كُنْتُمْ قَوْمًا طَاغِينَ. So we had no power over you, and it was indeed your own inclination towards sin, your own inclination towards falsehood that led you to follow us. We had no control over you. So this is how they would acquit themselves of any responsibility. The people of paradise are then mentioned that they will be honored with numerous blessings of food, drink, and companionship. أُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمْ رِزْقٌ مَعْلُومٌ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has defined provision for the people of paradise. And then يُطَافُ عَلَيْهِمْ بِكَأْسٍ مِّن مَّعِينٍ, that they will have drinks available to them. And those drinks, the wine of paradise, is not something that will have any ill effects like you see in this world on people who drink. They have headaches, they vomit. The next day is challenging for them. So all those ill effects of wine in this world will not be in the wine of hereafter, of Jannah. And then there's also going to be companionship. وَعِنْدَهُمْ قَاصِرَاتُ الطَّرْفِ عِينٌ. So there will be hurs in the hereafter as companions. And then in verse 56, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the impact of company onto an individual. So bad company leads to bad outcome. قَالَتَ اللَّهِ إِن كِدتَّ لَتُرْدِينَ وَلَوْلَا نِعْمَةُ رَبِّي لَكُنْتُ مِنَ الْمُحْضَرِينَ. So this is someone in Jannah who remembers a friend, and then he becomes curious as to where is that friend. And then he's made to look into the hellfire where this friend was going through punishment. And at that point, he reflects on how if he had been more close to this person, and if he had followed the attractions that this person was calling him towards, then he would also be in the same situation. So impact of friendships on individuals is something that cannot be taken lightly. And it is indeed only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who can protect us from the negative effects of bad company. So our job is to not be close to people who are involved in sin. And that's really where we do our effort, and it is indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that will ultimately protect us from the harm or ill effects of such companionship. True success is to attain the everlasting life of paradise. إِنَّ هَذَا لَهُوَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ. It is the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that leads to the best outcome, which is paradise, and that is the great success. And then after describing the bounties of paradise, there is a reminder of punishment in hellfire. So people of hell will be served with zaqum, which is a thorny fruit. Then there is boiling water thrown upon them, and they'll be punished in scorching fire. And this process will continue one after another in succession and forever. أَذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ نُزُلًا أَمْ شَجَرَةُ الزَّقُّومِ ثُمَّ إِنَّ لَهُمْ عَلَيْهَا لَشَوْبًا مِّنْ حَمِيمٍ ثُمَّ إِنَّ مَرْجِعَهُمْ لَإِلَى الْجَحِيمِ. So this is how the sinners will be punished, one punishment after another in hellfire. We are discouraged from blind following of the practices and beliefs of the forefathers. Just because you adopted their practices and continued their customs, it's not an excuse to avoid punishment. إِنَّهُمْ أَلْفَوْا آبَاءَهُمْ ضَالِّينَ فَهُمْ عَلَىٰ آثَارِهِمْ يُهْرَعُونَ. You can take this in the context of shirk versus iman, but you can also extend this to the other practices that are in our society and culture that are against the practices of Islam, or against the teachings of Islam. And again, simply following and continuing those practices in your daily life because that's what your parents were doing is not a license to protect yourself from the punishment. Every individual, every Muslim is obligated to think through what are the right behaviors, what are the right actions that earn us the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and what actions are prohibited and should be avoided and are sinful. So that is our own accountability. We cannot lay the blame on parents for following the practices that we saw around us growing up in a family. World population today is the progeny of three sons of Nuh alayhi salam, Sam, Ham, and Japheth, who survived the Great Flood. There's an opinion, a majority opinion, that the flood was in the entire world and not localized to the place of Nuh alayhi salam. And that's why when Nuh alayhi salam escaped with his family, three sons and other people, followers around him, those people became the ancestors of the rest of the population that exists today in the world. So one group is the source of Arabs, another one Romans, and the third one of Ethiopians. And then the surah mentions the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, his father used to carve idols out of stone. Ibrahim alayhi salam rejected that practice, and he had an opportunity to destroy all those idols when there was a festival in town. And in order for him to escape out of that festival, he made an excuse. فَنَظَرَ نَظْرَةً فِي النُّجُومِ فَقَالَ إِنِّي سَقِيمٌ. So he looked at the stars, because at that time people used to follow astrology. So when he looked at the stars, he pretended as if he's following the practice of that culture. And then he made an excuse that he is sick when indeed he was not physically ill. And this was a way for him to get out of attending that festival, and then instead he would go out and destroy the idols. And then scholars have explained how Saqim does not necessarily mean someone who is sick, but it could have different meanings in different contexts. And in fact, it was not a complete lie, rather his attempt to remain at home. So that's where Thoria comes in, which is a practice where, when you say something, and this is under a need or given circumstances where it is required for a particular outcome, that a person may mean something distant in his speech, and yet the listener assumes that you're talking about something more immediate. Further on in the surah, there's mention of how Ismail alayhi salam, as he grew up to be about 13 years of age, he was to be sacrificed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded Ibrahim alayhi salam to sacrifice his son, and that was a big test. Ibrahim alayhi salam, until the age of 86, did not have any child. So his wife, Sarah alayhi salam, was barren, and then she advised that Ibrahim alayhi salam marry her maid, Hajar alayhi salam. And through Hajar alayhi salam, who was much younger, Ibrahim alayhi salam was given a son who was Ismail alayhi salam. And then as he grew up to an age of 13, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded as a test to sacrifice Ismail alayhi salam, and then in the end he was saved. And the practice continues until today in Eid al-Adha, where Muslims sacrifice an animal as a commemoration of that event. There is some debate among scholars that it was Ismail alayhi salam who was chosen for sacrifice. The Jewish and the Christian theologians believe it was Ishaq alayhi salam. رَبِّ هَبْ لِي مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ فَبَشَّرْنَاهُ بِغُلَامٍ حَلِيمٍ. And after this incident of Ismail alayhi salam, then the progeny of Ishaq alayhi salam is mentioned. وَبَارَكْنَا عَلَيْهِ وَعَلَى إِسْحَاقَ وَمِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِهِمَا مُحْسِنٌ وَظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ مُبِينٌ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions how the progeny of Ishaq alayhi salam would be inclusive of both good people and unjust people, which is unlike the Jewish belief that all the progeny of Ishaq alayhi salam are righteous. The surah references the stories of Musa alayhi salam and Harun alayhi salam when they went to Fir'aun and then their message was rejected, and in the end the army was drowned and Musa alayhi salam and Harun alayhi salam and the followers were protected. There are only 2 references of alayhi salam in the Quran, with not a lot of detail available through ahadith, but then through Israeliyat, some scholars have described in their Tafseer. People of Ilyas alayhi salam, they were worshipping the idol of Baal. Then when a famine occurred and Ilyas alayhi salam challenged them to do a sacrifice to end the famine in the area. And if their sacrifice is accepted, then they're on the truth, versus if the sacrifice of Ilyas alayhi salam is accepted, then everyone should know that he is the true messenger. Lut alayhi salam is also mentioned in the surah that his family was saved, but his wife was not, because she was also involved in the practice of sodomy that his entire nation was practicing, which led to an extreme punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then after that, Yunus alayhi salam and his story is mentioned, how he left his people in anticipation of punishment, but behind him, his nation repented to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected them and did not send his punishment. However, Yunus alayhi salam went out on a boat, so people drew the straws, and in the end, it was decided that Yunus alayhi salam would be thrown in the sea. Yunus alayhi salam was engulfed by a whale where he lived in, and this for some say 3 to all the way to 40 days. And when he made dua, La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu minaz zalimin, that dua was so powerful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted it and saved him from this situation, and then the whale threw him onto a shore. So فَلَوْلَا أَنَّهُ كَانَ مِنَ الْمُسَبِّحِينَ لَلَبِثَ فِي بَطْنِهِ إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 143, that if it wasn't for this tasbih, he would have lived in, or he would have stayed in the stomach of the whale. And then Surah continues on to talk about other misconceptions that the mushrikeen had. So angels who are not daughters of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, aliyadu billah, as falsely claimed by polytheists. أَمْ خَلَقْنَا الْمَلَائِكَةَ إِنَاثًا وَهُمْ شَاهِدُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked them, were you there when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the angels, so you know that they were females? And of course, that was not the case. So this was a way to present to the mushrikeen how they do not have the right knowledge, and yet they are claiming that the angels were the daughters of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And only stubborn people are the ones who are destined to hellfire. فَإِنَّكُمْ وَمَا تَعْبُدُونَ مَا أَنْتُمْ عَلَيْهِ بِفَاتِنِينَ إِلَّا مَنْ هُوَ صَالِ الْجَحِيمِ. Towards the end of the surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the angels again, that they remain in worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, standing in rows and glorifying Him. وَإِنَّا لَنَحْنُ الصَّافُّونَ وَإِنَّا لَنَحْنُ الْمُسَبِّحُونَ. And the messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the prophets, are guaranteed to be successful and victorious. وَلَقَدْ سَبَقَتْ كَلِمَتُنَا لِعِبَادِنَا الْمُرْسَلِينَ إِنَّهُمْ لَهُمُ الْمَنْصُورُونَ وَإِنَّ جُنْدَنَا لَهُمُ الْغَالِبُونَ. We'll stop here. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم.